What's going on now
What?
is, as I can tell, is that all over the world, everybody lives in one managerial state or another, whether that's an American satrapy like Israel or um, like a sovereign managerial state like
I th-
China,
I
right?
think I think there are important differences between the Chinese system and the American system.
Right.
They're really very different in many interesting ways. They both sort of involve like a sort of ranked cadre in a way, but I find if you're gonna have a one party state, I think that actually admitting that it's a one party state makes a great deal of sense and simplifies a lot of things.
Sure.
So, the competition between those systems is interesting, and they're very different systems. But, there is a monarchical element in these Marxist Leninist states, which is really absent in the West. But go on.
But they're all undergoing a very similar underlying process. And I wanted to bring up something that Carlyle brought up, right?
Hmm.
Thomas Carlyle,
Sure.
whom I read when I read references to him on your blog. He had a book which I'm not going to say the title of on this,
Mm,
the neighbor question.
yes.
And
The neighbor question.
in
Right.
the neighbor
In the
question,
neighborhood.
yes, Carlisle says, "Listen, we're leaving Jamaica. All the Jamaicans, used to be our slaves, and now they're not going to have to work. They can sit around eating various."
Pumpkins. Pumpkins.
Yes, yeah. I'm not gonna quote
Yeah.
the whole thing,
No.
but basically, this is going to be very bad for the Jamaicans because they're just going to degrade. Um, as it, of course, Jamaica has proven them wrong. It's turned into Singapore and the Caribbean. Do as
Sure.
Coke
Sure.
is a startup
Sure,
founder,
you
etc.
probably drive a Jamaican car,
I've
and like
I'm we're doing
you're
this. The
considering one. It's an
computer,
electric solar model. Yeah,
the
right,
computer, I
right.
believe, is made in. All right, fine. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but I think we're all Jamaicans now, meaning that
Mm.
effectively most people don't need to really work anymore in the same sense that
Well, we saw that it's true, and we saw that in America in COVID, where we had this sort of frightening realization that we lived in the pretend economy because nobody worked for a while and it was fine.
yeah.
Like
I mean,
the
no, people
money
work,
kept flowing.
but half the
Yeah,
people didn't work,
half the
or
people didn't work. Yeah,
75% of
yeah.
people didn't work.
You still have a certain number of people that are needed to actually maintain the infrastructure, but it's
Run the CNC
relatively
machines.
small. Run the CT machines. A lot of it is like, first of all, it's like when you sort of, I mean, the Gulf states are really in advance of all of us here. Like whenever I meet these Silicon Valley, what's the word? It rhymes with maggots. But whenever I meet these Silicon Valley friends who like believe in universal basic income, I'm like, have you heard of the United Arab Emirates? Have you heard of the Gulf states? Because thanks to the beneficent products of the dinosaur, they have managed to basically give their citizens, that is their actual citizens, universal basic income. And
Sure.
so they're essentially, when people talk about UBI or they talk about, fully automated luxury communism, they're basically talking about turning us all into Emiratis.
That may
And the
be
Emirati is one of the most, I don't mind saying, this, the Emirati is one of the most useless creatures that God ever created. I mean, the armadillo, for example, has a legitimate role in aerating the desert soil. I don't know what the desert would be with no armadillos. Even the humble skunk is needed to control the snail and slug population, but like I don't know why an Emirati is needed. I feel that like and that's not, this is not the mark of Cain or whatever. This is the result of basically creating a society in which human beings are useless. And so, different kinds of, I mean, one of the things they have, for example, in the Gulf, is they have these rigid religious social structures that basically can take useless people and at least keep them sort of in a groove, keep them on the derech, as you might say.
Based.
And yeah, exactly. And based Islam, right? And okay, fine, but I still like human beings are not made to be useless. Like that's
Right.
of course one of Carlyle's great lines in this sort of different essay. He's basically like, well, sort of, really food, water, and pleasure are like enough for like a pig. Like if you were a
Pig
pig, that would be all
philosophy,
that you
right?
needed. Pig
What's
philosophy,
he
right,
lampooned
right.
utilitarianism, and he said, from the
He lim
perspective of a pig, we should optimize the amount of slop and so on and so forth, so that we all
right,
have room
right.
to trough. Right. So
Totally
luxury pig
anticipating
communism.
exactly, totally anticipating Peter Singer, right? And if you're basically trying to maximize the amount of pleasure in the world, you come up like technology creates, the most incredible like monsters, right? But if you're trying to maximize the production of excellence
Right.
in this world, you'll take a very different tack.
Yes.
And
Wait. I
you'll
want to
you
get into that right in a sec.
yeah,
Hold
sure.
on. Hold on. I want to take a small aside.
All
We're
right.
seeing in all these managerial states, China, US, whatever, except for Israel, by the way, we're seeing demographic collapse. And
Uh-huh.
it's a function of moral collapse, right? And I'd say a
Sure.
function of religious collapse, just like
It's
Carlyle
like
talked
yeah,
about a sham
it's a
kings brought
collapse.
about by a sham god.
It's a collapse of meaning. I mean, like obviously the idea of having children. How many kids do you have,
I've got
Brooke?
so far six, thank God.
That's solid. That's solid. Well, praise be to God. I have half of that. And the like my newest is 6 months old.
Oh, thank God.
And
Wonderful.
the yeah, he's beautiful. And but yeah, the sort of if basically the purpose of your life is to sort of maximize the integral of pleasure over time, which is the utilitarian axiom. The problem with that axiom is that, especially as technology advances, you get a reductio ad absurdum, right? If your axiom enables you to prove that 2 + 2 = 5, or that it's basically good for everyone to be like hooked up to a heroin stent on the day of their birth, then obviously there is something wrong with your axiom, because the result is absurd and unconscionable and clearly just wrong.
Gross.
And
Right.
it's
So,
gross. And so, sort of realizing that is I don't know, the beginning of some kind of wisdom, I guess.
so you touched on human quality, and I was thinking about this. I was thinking, okay, what's human quality? What's nobility? What's
Yeah.
moral strength and courage, right? And I was thinking,
RAK.
yeah,
Uh,
sure.
yeah.
Um, I went to a high IQ educational establishment. I understand you went to CTY, which I also
Yeah.
attended back
You
before
did.
it is
You
what it
did.
apparently is now, which is some sort of trans indoctrination facility.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
informed by
Yeah.
Twitter
Well,
people.
I'm
So,
sending my daughter. I'm sending my daughter there this summer. We'll see
oh
what she
gosh,
comes out as.
okay,
That's all
well,
right. That's all right. She's a tough specimen.
so this is like the human as border collie, right? Like high IQ humans
Yeah.
as two-legged border collies. Let's give you abstract problems and see how fast it can solve them, how cleverly. But this is
Sure.
this is plainly not human quality, right? It's not really nobility. And I was thinking that in my mind, nobility is your ability to annul your ego and impress in the service of higher values, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's like self-actualization on Maslow's pyramid of needs, right? And
Well,
if
it's
you're
the
I
opposite.
know. I literally I understand that when you look at that term, it has this literally narcissistic meaning. And one of the things that I've sort of reflected on is my ex, the mother of my child, is a woman who's has sort of considerable mystical practices and attainments, honestly. And one of the things you sort of realize in Western people when they get into Eastern religions, the occult, anything like that, is you realize, and I don't know how this relates to, the human differences between these peoples, but when you look at successful Western religions, when you look at successful Western religions at their highest pinnacle of value, they tend to involve service and obedience to God, to, however that is conceived, to, a higher power, as they say in AA. And whereas when you look at Eastern religion tends to focus on becoming God. You become a living Buddha. You become, and the sort of the potential for, you know, intensive, basically for placing what's essentially narcissism at the top of the pyramid of needs, where basically, serving God is, was what was placed there by 2,000 years of even just our Christian ancestors. Then I think you sort of realize the kind of depth of the spiritual crisis that's going on there.
I've dabbled in Eastern religions too, dude. Not in the Nam, of
Yeah.
course. No. Just kidding. But I thought that stuff was
Yeah.
kind of cool when I was an impressionable
Yeah.
teenager and reading
Exactly.
like 1960s Ken Kesey type, from that milieu type stuff.
Yeah.
The
But
funniest,
all that stuff aims at making you yourself God in a
yeah,
way.
of course,
Like that's yeah.
of course, it's all
Yeah.
in self-service. The funniest thing about all that is that recently we're seeing. I read that I think DT Suzuki was the guy's name that really brought Zen to the
Uh-huh.
whole San
Yeah.
Francisco beatnik milieu. I was reading memoirs of one of his followers. It turned out surprisingly that those guys are massive degenerates and
You
alcoholics
think?
and promiscuous and stuff. And of course, we're seeing pictures of the Dalai Lama engaging in some very questionable practices.
Really?
So
What has the Dalai Lama done? Does he rape? Does he
he's out there. I think a picture of him tongue kissing some boy. I don't really want to get into.
Wow.
It was fairly
Oh,
recent.
that's disturbing. Yeah.
Yeah, gross.
Sure.
Whatever. I can't believe the Dalai Lama would do. All right, fine. Enough of that.
Yeah.
The
Sure.
opposite of quality, the opposite of nobility is kind of even before utilitarianism. You have humans as Hobbes modeled them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what's man according to Hobbes? Um,
Um,
Basically a
you
bundle of
know,
desires, and the only thing that's keeping me from turning my neighbors into steaks if I'm hungry is just the fact that there's a sovereign and he'll probably punish me. I don't want to be punished, so therefore no neighbor steaks, right?
yeah, sure. I mean, I mean, perhaps it's a bit of a parody of Hobbesian thinking, and you have to understand it as a sort of correction to the very ossified world that existed around Hobbes. But
Ossified.
sure.
Hobbes
Well,
was watching the British Revolution. I
yeah,
mean, they
no,
cut the
no,
king's
no,
head
no,
off.
no.
What's
I know,
ossified
I
about
know,
that?
I know. I mean, Hobbes is basically penetrating, people like Hobbes and like Maestra, kind of go together in my mind. And of course, even the later Burke, but more Hobbes and Maestra, and George Fitzhugh, I think would fit in this category, come to mind because they have this, of course, reactionary, like sort of real appreciation for tradition. Their style is very modern for the time that they're in. And so, Maestra is writing all of this stuff about the sacred authority of the Pope. And this is all very well and good, but he sounds like Voltaire. He thinks like Voltaire. And the result, for these people is that the conservative authorities of their time, the ones who haven't actually kind of passed through some kind of modern free thinking, never really trust these people
Rightfully
because
so.
yeah, exactly, they have this sort of smell of brimstone about them, even if you can't sort of put your, yeah, I mean, you're of course just sort of as a convert, like very familiar with this question,
I'm
right? The
I'm
convert is, I
I'm a
mean,
revert, man. I'm a Baal Tshuva, but yes, of
yes,
course.
yes, I know what you mean. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
yes,
I
of
know what you mean.
course.
So, but once you model people as kind of the Hobbesian Homo sapiens, by the way, Hobbes thought that religion should completely be in the service of the state. Um,
Yeah.
because people who are truly religious do unpredictable, loopy stuff, and it's not good for the sovereign. And
I feel that that is absolutely true, and it is just as true to say the state should be completely in service to religion. I don't think that consider that to be completely and inarguably true, and I think they're the same truth if you look at them from different sides.
I guess you can make that case, but in the time of
Well,
Hobbes, I guess
yeah.
you can see why they were suspicious of him for saying this. But
Indeed, indeed.
today we've kept Hobbes's model, which is kind of the pig philosophy model, which is to say people are basically a sort of animal to be managed, right? I mean, there's no such thing as
Yeah.
a soul. There's no such thing
Well,
as God.
I think in many cases they do better if they thought of them as animals, right? I think that there's a lot of it would be difficult to imagine the managers of the state of the Ukraine if they just thought of their population as mere human cattle to like sacrifice that number of cattle in such a way. But like
There's always, you can always go down. I mean, there's always something worse. Sure,
that's
I've
true.
never
That's
seen a
true. That's
farmer
true.
try to trans a
That's true.
sheep. You
Barak,
know,
have you ever considered going and fighting for the freedom of the Ukrainian people
um,
against the evil monster Putin? You could
we'll get
volunteer. You're
into.
not too old.
I'll tell you what, man. We'll get into the Ukraine a little bit later. Um, I read both sides of the conflict, and given kind
Hmm.
of the total, we'll make a brief digression on the Ukraine.
Are you a native? What result do you expect of the war at present?
Well, it's either, I mean, either way, continued depopulation of countries that can't afford it,
Hmm.
and
Yeah,
demoralization, further human degradation
sure.
on an industrial scale. Maybe it'll spread to a regional or global conflict. I don't know. It's basically a
Hmm.
competition between which side can be dumber and more brutal. And
Hmm.
I expect nothing good from any of it.
Yeah, that I would agree on. Sorry.
So look, what I see is that of course you have just general sadistic stuff like, I've never seen a farmer, even a negligent farmer, try to, trans his sheep or whatever. But generally I see that people are managed like livestock today, right? They're managed by
Hmm.
debt, they're managed by specialization, right?
Yeah, I
Homogenization,
mean, but
atomization.
there's a perversity to it that I think is the most like it's like if you want to, one of the things I don't like about sort of Burnhamism is that he was writing at the time when these regimes were a lot more rational and hadn't sort of like accumulated like the sort of level of burden of bad ideas that they have. And so, certainly when you look at early 20th century progressivism, which I'm much more in sympathy with than kind of late 20th century progressivism, you do see a sense of like, of course, the relationship between shepherd and sheep is a traditional metaphor of government. It's found many times in the Bible. So the fact that the sheep are not being protected from the wolves and not being led to pasture and that they're being led into the desert and fed to the lions, this is like uniquely disturbing from the perspective of anyone who's interested in like the history of governments.
Well, as Hunter S. Thompson said, we've learned a lot about race relations since then.
Indeed, and it's all been for the worse.
Look, I have to, my personal point of view is that when you have a system like this, it inevitably leads to When you have a system like early and mid 20th century progressivism, it inevitably leads to what we see today,
I
which
agree with
is
that. I
just
agree
total
with that.
degradation and stupidation. You
I
can't
agree with that. I
say,
agree with that. I agree with that. And I would say the thing to understand is, if there's like one thing that I want people to understand the most, it's the connection between this sort of oligarchical meritocracy thing, whatever you call the managerial state. I have a bone to pick with that, whatever you call it. Like, this is like a petri dish for bad ideas. You're not going to grow in that structural environment. The things in the sort of the processes of the oligarchical state, the ideas that succeed in the marketplace of ideas are not good ideas. They are bad ideas.
I,
And like, that's really important. And because what it tells you is that when you do have this, I mean, just call it an unaccountable bureaucracy. That's the low IQ version of all of this. Like, an unaccountable bureaucracy is like, breeds like bad ideas, the way like box of macaroni and cheese you left in your fridge for like 6 months like breeds mold. And the sort of, when you look at the specific bad ideas that it comes up with, just strange sexual things, most of all lately, it's like, understand that, kind of learn to see these effects in an inhuman way as just basically epiphenomena of this really, really, really wrong structure of the state.
well, I think the structure itself is an epiphenomenon of a basic idea, which is that you can, I think you called communism, like define communism as management by experts at one point.
Yeah, no, I think the management by experts is, I mean, that is sort of the structure. And even the idea that like management by experts is better than
Yes. Man-
monarchy, which seems obvious to everyone but is extremely wrong,
well,
is like, sure, I mean, does the idea or the social structure, or like, what comes first there?
well,
Um,
let's ask Carlyle. Carlyle said that sham kings were a result of sham God. That,
yeah,
Nietzsche's idea that God is dead because science killed him, and anything that we need, we can just think our way to it. We can reason our way to it from first principles. I want to leave off on this note.
okay.
There's a 19th century economist whose last name
Mm-hmm.
was List. He was a German, but he
Indeed.
lived and worked in
Indeed.
America. And his
Mm-hmm.
idea was very simple. His idea was that economics needs to be optimized to produce better people, meaning the
Mm-hmm.
human capital of a
Yes,
nation is it's the most
indeed.
important capital. We see that very clearly in the 20th century, where places that literally got nuked, like Japan, rebuilt their country to powerhouses. Um, Places that were run according to the latest managerial theories,
Mm-hmm.
are run are basically degrading the human capital, which is the substrate for the country, right?
Right.
Um, my question is this: is there you are trying to come up with a way to reform the managerial state, to re-engineer it, that with the proper incentives they can start building their human capital and stop degrading it, right? um
Sure.
I mean, that can we can kind of summarize your efforts, if I
Sure.
had
But
to.
that
That's it.
basically, that comes about through what's essentially a monarchical state, and
Okay.
the relationship of the citizen, of the subject, to the monarchical state. First of all, the monarchical state is not run from the bottom up like an oligarchy. It's run from the top down. Secondly, its relations with the individual are different, because under any conceivable regime that aimed at basically maximizing the quality of human capital, you're going to look at society and you're going to see that there's basically two kinds of people out there. There's people who are basically atomic, in that they are responsible, or adults living in the free market, like libertarians or whatever. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I this is terrible. And like libertarians or
What would
whatever.
Carlyle say about
And
this language?
yeah, that's a good question. What would he say about the atomic libertarian people? He might say, if he was feeling generous, that there are ways in which aristocrats have always lived that way. Aristocrats have always been cut from social ties in that sense. I think there are a lot more of those people than there should be, but you have to recognize their existence, because what exists is, what God willed to exist. And so you have people that are like genuinely atomic and sort of thrive in that aristocratic way of being. And then you have people that don't, who either are attached or, more importantly, need to be attached to a community, which will be a small homogenous community that will basically take ownership and control over them. And if they're basically communal human beings, they should not have any direct relationship with the central government. The central government should have a relationship, have an institutional relationship with their communities. And so, what that means in practice is, their bank account is community script. They don't pay taxes. They'll shop at community stores and have that sort of be converted on a like keep the money in the community kind of basis. You basically
put
will
all the
see
goyim into the shtetl. That's what you want.
Well, it depends on the kind
I
of going.
gotcha.
I
Listen,
yeah, the every sure, and like there are people who want to live in something like a shtetl today, and some of them are actually Jews, and some of them are very goyish, and
well, I guess the Amish.
yeah, the Amish, sure, exactly,
Look,
right,
you're trying to come up with a formula which will be
I
like a
am.
governmental perpetual motion machine,
It's
but
a very, very, vague formula, but like
can't
if you
you
don't
can't
have, I mean,
formalize discretion and wisdom, right?
yeah, no, there's always, it's true. Like, the state can always make an exception and reach past down into the community. But normally, like, if you're a youth in the community and you cause trouble, like, your reverend can have you horsewhipped, and there will be no trouble under those
The
circumstances.
Noahide
If
laws.
that,
I knew it. I
you know,
knew it.
yeah, exactly. All right. Well, let's
To be
presumably
continued.
you'll put this up in some kind of debased form, and then we'll continue at a
Okay.
later date. All
Okay.
right, all right,
So,
all right.
all right. Thank you very much for your time,
Great
Curtis. I
talking to you
really
as always,
appreciate it.
Brooke,
And have fun at your
and
party. Happy
we'll do.
birthday.
All right, take care. Bye.